Bienvenidos a la Asia de la Píldora Roja, uno más del patriarcado. Les saluda y les da las gracias por escuchar el día de hoy. Como es de costumbre, antes de iniciar cada video, vamos a recordar que el enlace para la página de Facebook y mis canales paralelos se encuentra abajo en la descripción. El día de hoy quería dar una explicación de por qué personas como Agustín Laje o Márquez y compañía hablan del término nueva izquierda y qué tiene que ver esto con lo que está sucediendo en la sociedad actual que nos perjudica a nosotros como hombres, sino también que da una explicación enmarcada o globalizada de qué es el movimiento feminista y por qué se les dice nuevas izquierdas a todas estas políticas de identidad y ideologías de género y esto. Es muy importante que veamos estos dos videos que voy a poner acá en orden para poder comprender qué está sucediendo. El primero, creo que no muchos lo han visto, me he tomado la molestia de subtitularlo, y habla de un aspecto más geopolítico orientado a cierta época. Tal vez muchos, en especial al final de este primer video incrustado, no van a encontrar mucho sentido a lo que quiero dar a entender, pero cuando ya hayan visto este video y vean el segundo, las piezas del rompecabezas les van a encajar perfectamente y van a poder comprender en la totalidad cuál es el panorama social y político de lo que estamos viviendo ahora mismo y por qué se usa el término de nuevas izquierdas. Ahora, reitero antes de iniciar, yo no deseo que esto se convierta en un tema de discusión político de si la izquierda es buena o mala o la derecha es buena o mala o cuál es mejor que la otra, sino que lo tomen como una explicación de qué es lo que está sucediendo en la sociedad actual que nos termina perjudicando a nosotros y que ha dado inicio a estilos de vida incluso como el MGTOW, donde nos protegemos de todo este tipo de ideas que tienen una cola que perjudica a muchas personas, incluyendo al hombre blanco heterosexual. Y espero que el ver estos dos videos en orden les aclare las ideas y los conceptos de qué es lo que está sucediendo actualmente en la sociedad y qué significa exactamente el término nueva izquierda y por qué se le dice de esa manera. Vamos a proceder a ver los dos videos.
Mr. Bezmenov was born in 1939 in a suburb of Moscow. He was the son of a high-ranking Soviet Army officer. He was educated in the elite schools inside the Soviet Union and became an expert in Indian culture and Indian languages. He had an outstanding career with Novosti, which was and still is, I should say, the press arm or the press agency of the Soviet Union. It turns out that this is also a front for the KGB. He escaped to the West in 1970 after becoming totally disgusted with the Soviet system, and he did this at great risk to his life. He certainly is one of the world's outstanding experts on the subject of Soviet propaganda and disinformation and active measures. Well, you spoke several times before about ideological subversion. That is a phrase that I'm afraid some Americans don't fully understand. When the Soviets use the phrase ideological subversion, what do they mean by it?
Ideological subversion is the slow process which we call either ideological subversion or active measures, активные мероприятия in the language of the KGB, or psychological warfare. What it basically means is to change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent that despite of the abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interests of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country. It's a great brainwashing process which goes very slow, and it's divided in four basic stages. The first one being demoralization. It takes from 15 to 20 years to demoralize a nation. Why that many years? Because this is the minimum number of years which requires to educate one generation of students in the country of your enemy, exposed to the ideology of the enemy. In other words, Marxism-Leninism ideology is being pumped into the soft heads of at least 3 generations of American students without being challenged or counterbalanced by the basic values of Americanism, American patriotism. The demoralization process in the United States is basically completed already. For the last 25 years. Actually, it's overfulfilled because demoralization now reaches such areas where previously not even Comrade Andropov and all his experts would even dream of such a tremendous success. Most of it is done by Americans to Americans, thanks to lack of moral standards. As I mentioned before, exposure to true information does not matter anymore. A person who was demoralized is unable to assess true information. The facts tell nothing to him. Even if I shower him with information, with authentic proof, with documents, with pictures, even if I take him by force to the Soviet Union and show him concentration camp, he will refuse to believe it until he is going to receive a kick in his fat bottom. When a military boot crashes his balls, then he will understand, but not before that. That's the tragic of the situation of demoralization. The next stage is destabilization. This time, subverter does not care about your ideas and the patterns of your consumption. Whether you eat junk food and get fat and flabby, doesn't matter anymore. This time, and it takes only from 2 to 5 years to destabilize a nation, what matters is essentials: economy, foreign relations, defense systems. And you can see it quite clearly that in some areas, in such sensitive areas as defense and economy, the influence of Marxist-Leninist ideas in the United States is absolutely fantastic. I could never believe it 14 years ago when I landed in this part of the world that the process will go that fast. The next stage, of course, is crisis. It may take only up to 6 weeks to bring a country to the verge of crisis. You can see it in Central America now. And after crisis, with a violent change of power, structure, and economy, you have so-called the period of normalization. It may last indefinitely. Normalization is a cynical expression borrowed from Soviet propaganda. When the Soviet tanks moved into Czechoslovakia in '68, Comrade Brezhnev said, "Now the situation in brotherly Czechoslovakia is normalized." This is what will happen in the United States if you allow all these schmucks to bring the country to crisis, to promise people all kind of goodies and the paradise on earth, to destabilize your economy, to eliminate the principle of free market competition, and to put a big brother government in Washington, D.C., with benevolent dictators like Walter Mondale, who will promise lots of things, never mind whether the promises are fulfillable or not. Your leftists in the United States, all these professors and all these beautiful civil rights defenders, they are instrumental in the process of the subversion only to destabilize the nation. When their job is completed, they are not needed anymore. They know too much. Some of them, when they get disillusioned, when they see that Marxist-Leninists come to power, obviously they get offended. They think that they will come to power. That will never happen, of course. They will be lined up against the wall and shot. But they may turn into the most bitter enemies of Marxist-Leninists when they come to power. And that's what happened in Nicaragua. You remember most of these former Marxist-Leninists were either put to prison or one of them split, and now he's working against Sandinistas. It happened in Grenada when Maurice Bishop was already a Marxist. He was executed by a new Marxist who was more Marxist than this Marxist. Same happened in Afghanistan when first there was Taraki, he was killed by Amin, then Amin was killed by Babrak Karmal with the help of KGB. Same happened in Bangladesh when Mujibur Rahman, very pro-Soviet leftist, was assassinated by his own Marxist-Leninist military comrades. It's the same pattern everywhere. The time bomb is ticking, but every second the disaster.
Ya una vez visto este primer video, vamos a proceder a ver el segundo video que va a terminar de armar las piezas del rompecabezas que quiero armar el día de hoy. Este primer video nos ha servido para ver cómo se puede introducir una ideología o una forma de pensar en un país incluso cuando es enemigo y cómo las propias personas de este país ideológicamente invadido van a empezar a formar y a adoctrinar a las demás personas de este país desde las universidades especialmente, que ese es el gran problema que tenemos hoy y de donde se ha esparcido todo esto del feminismo, ideologías de género, todo esto, desde las universidades. Y estas personas que se gradúan de las universidades luego trabajan como periodistas que terminan de informar a las personas, luego trabajan como políticos que toman puestos de jerarquías sociales y empiezan a imponer poco a poco este tipo de leyes. Este primer video, si bien toca temas un poco más geopolíticos, nos da una idea clara de cómo invadieron ideológicamente a Occidente y cómo ahora estamos viendo las repercusiones de esta invasión ideológica en lo que es la dictadura de la ideología de género, que nos afecta indirectamente a nosotros, los hombres también. Vamos a ver el segundo video.
You may not realize it, but you are currently funding some dangerous people. They are indoctrinating young minds throughout the West with their resentment-ridden ideology. They have made it their life's mission to undermine Western civilization itself, which they regard as corrupt, oppressive, and patriarchal. If you're a taxpayer or paying for your kid's liberal arts degree, you're underwriting this gang of nihilists. You're supporting ideologues who claim that all truth is subjective, that all sex differences are socially constructed, and that Western imperialism is the sole source of all third world problems. They are the postmodernists, pushing progressive activism at a college near you. They produce the mobs that violently shut down campus speakers, the language police who enshrine into law use of fabricated gender pronouns, and the deans whose livelihoods depend on madly rooting out discrimination, where little or none exists. Their thinking took hold in Western universities in the 60s and 70s, when the true believers of the radical left became the professors of today. And now we rack up education-related debt, not so that our children learn to think critically, write clearly, or speak properly, but so they can model their mentors' destructive agenda. It's now possible to complete an English degree and never encounter Shakespeare, one of those dead white males whose works underlie our society of oppression. To understand and oppose the postmodernists, the ideas by which they orient themselves must be clearly identified. First is their new unholy trinity of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Diversity is defined not by opinion, but by race, ethnicity, or sexual identity. Equity is no longer the laudable goal of equality of opportunity, but the insistence on equality of outcome. And inclusion is the use of identity-based quotas to attain this misconceived state of equity. All the classic rights of the West are to be considered secondary to these new values. Take, for example, freedom of speech, the very pillar of democracy. The postmodernists refuse to believe that people of goodwill can exchange ideas and reach consensus. Their world is instead a Hobbesian nightmare of identity groups warring for power. They don't see ideas that run contrary to their ideology as simply incorrect. They see them as integral to the oppressive system they wish to supplant, and consider it a moral obligation to stifle and constrain their expression. Second is rejection of the free market, of the very idea that free voluntary trading benefits everyone. They won't acknowledge that capitalism has lifted up hundreds of millions of people, so they can, for the first time in history, afford food, shelter, clothing, transportation, even entertainment and travel. Those classified as poor in the US, and increasingly everywhere else, are able to meet their basic needs. Meanwhile, in once prosperous Venezuela, until recently the poster child of the campus radicals, the middle class lines up for toilet paper. Third and finally are the politics of identity. Postmodernists don't believe in individuals. You're an exemplar of your race, sex, or sexual preference. You're also either a victim or an oppressor. No wrong can be done by anyone in the former group, and no good by the latter. Such ideas of victimization do nothing but justify the use of power and engender intergroup conflict. All these concepts originated with Karl Marx, the 19th century German philosopher. Marx viewed the world as a gigantic class struggle, the bourgeoisie against the proletariat, the grasping rich against the desperate poor. But wherever his ideas were put into practice, in the Soviet Union, China, Vietnam, and Cambodia, to name just a few, whole economies failed and tens of millions were killed. We fought a decades-long Cold War to stop the spread of those murderous notions. But they're back, in the new guise of identity politics. The corrupt ideas of the postmodern neo-Marxists should be consigned to the dustbin of history. Instead, we underwrite their continuance in the very institutions where the central ideas of the West should be transmitted across the generations. Unless we stop, postmodernism will do to America and the entire Western world what it's already done to its universities. I'm Jordan Peterson, professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, for Prager University.
Bueno, visto los dos videos ya, quiero comentar que si no han notado, en la primera parte, en la introducción del video, puse solo imágenes de la era soviética. Tras ver el primer video, en la introducción al segundo, puse imágenes un poco más occidentales, pero que también están relacionadas con la izquierda. Y ahora estamos viendo imágenes, mientras estoy hablando, modernas, de los tiempos actuales. Y quiero que vean cómo están totalmente entrelazadas desde el inicio hasta la parte media, hasta la actualidad, y cómo el primer video explica la invasión ideológica en centros universitarios y cómo en el segundo video, en el que habla el doctor Jordan Peterson, se explica a cabalidad el resultado de lo que explicaba el señor del primer video, el resultado de la invasión ideológica y de cómo esto sí viene desde las izquierdas, y por eso se le dice en la actualidad nuevas izquierdas a esto que está sucediendo. Yo hay un punto donde no estoy de acuerdo en que se les diga nuevas izquierdas, pero es un tema que vamos a dejar por aparte en el video. Pero como es la terminología que se usa en la mayoría actualmente, vale la pena seguir esta secuencia de imágenes y de videos para comprender qué es lo que está sucediendo. ¿Y a qué viene todo esto al tema? Muchos se van a decir, pues si recuerdan los principios fundamentales de este estilo de vida, del cual voy a dejar abajo el enlace también en la descripción a mi video donde lo leo, y donde abajo en la descripción de ese otro video está el enlace para que lo descarguen, se van a dar cuenta que ahí habla de la responsabilidad social que tenemos como MGTOW a la hora de votar por políticos que no apoyen este tipo de ideologías que nos hacen daño a nosotros mismos a la larga. Y esto es algo que se ha visto mucho en mi país, como votamos a un partido político llamado el PAC durante 2 sesiones consecutivas, y el paternalismo populista hacia los sectores, entre comillas, más necesitados de la sociedad han destruido la economía, y cómo terminamos aceptando y promoviendo un montón de políticas y de ideologías que lo único que han hecho ha sido destruir al hombre blanco heterosexual en nuestra sociedad. Y es que yo quiero hacer esta seguidilla histórica de videos y de imágenes para que se logre comprender qué es lo que está sucediendo y a qué y a quiénes nos enfrentamos realmente. No es un enemigo nuevo. Así que yo les agradezco la madurez con la que han visto el video y la comprensión de que este es un tema histórico y no un debate político. Y muchas gracias por haber visto el día de hoy lo que tenía que presentarles a ustedes. Muy agradecido.